Hello, everyone. My name is Jaden Latimer, and I will be presenting my elementary statistics final project for the spring 2024 semester. For the objective of our project, it was to gather data from Ventura College students to better show what factors allowed them to use campus resources. For some of the questions that we asked in this survey, they included 4 quantitative, 4 categorical, and 2 two-choice questions. These questions explored the number of classes taken by students, minutes spent commuting from whether it was home or work to the school, along with the student's major and preferred class structure, as well as a couple others as well. While most of our survey questions were okay, there were several that we could not use due to affecting the outcome of the project, such as invalid data entries or biased data entries as well. So now we go on to some of our good questions, such as what is your major? For that question, it was pretty straightforward. You would answer with a qualitative answer, so something in writing, so no numbers. So such as whether it was math or business or nursing, something like that. The second question that was actually a good question that we were able to use was what class structure do you prefer? So for that, you had a choice between 3 options. You had either online, just fully online, hybrid, which is a combination between online and in person, or just straight in person. The third question that we had that was good was how likely are you to recommend Ventura College to prospective students? So this one was a range. We had between very likely and strongly unlikely, and you could choose anywhere in between those, which were pretty straightforward. Now we go on to some of our more problematic questions, such as how often do you use campus services at Ventura College? Where we had very often, neither, not often, or never. You may be thinking, well, this seems like a pretty straightforward question, which it is, but at the same time, it doesn't provide a clear level of how many times they actually are using the resources, where I may think that my often is once a week and someone else may think that their often is 3 times a week. So a better question for that would be, how many times a week do you use the campus resources at Ventura College, rather than having a range so that you get more accurate data. So now we go on to actually cleaning the data. So for this, we had different procedures on how to clean the data. So when cleaning the data, it helps reduce errors by fixing all the mistakes in the data entry. So any typos, any missed words, so if there was any numbers where it should have been letters, we would fix all of that. Cleaning the data also ensures consistency, so making sure that all of our data follows the same format, which is kind of like the reducing the errors. So making sure, for example, we had commuting times. So we decided to do that all in minutes. So we would change all of our data. If there was any 1 hour, 2 hours, we would change that to either 60 minutes, 120 minutes, and so on. We also handled the missing data. So in some of our our survey questions, some of those responses weren't there, but instead of making up our own data because that would be biased, we had to reduce our number of surveyed people, so we weren't able to use that data, which caused the survey group to decrease. We also had to detect outliers. So this would be identifying and managing the data points that are significantly different from the rest. So we did have a couple back to the commuting times where one person may have said 1 minute and another person may have said 300 minutes. So we had to kind of find the midpoints for those as well. Then we had to normalize the data. So we had to adjust all the measurements to just make sure that they were all comparable to each other. We also needed to improve the interpretation, so making the data easier to understand and draw conclusions from. So make sure that everyone is able to properly understand what we were asking. So that goes back to our good questions. And then also boosting the confidence, which increases the trust in our survey results by ensuring the data quality. So as you can see on our clean data, we have our classes enrolled. All of these are all numerical. When we go into these were how likely were you to recommend Ventura College students, or how likely were you to recommend prospective students to Ventura College? So we had the likely, the neutral, the very likely, and so on. And then we had how often are you to use the campus resources at Ventura College. This one was kind of hard because we had rarely, which you don't really know what rarely means to some people. And then we had our commute time on here, which was all in minutes, as you can see. And then we had our preferred course style, whether it was in person, online, or hybrid. So now we go into breaking down some of the data. So for this one, we decided to do the classes that you were enrolled in. As you can see, it is a moderate sample size, which, as you can see over here, it was 54, which is a pretty good size. The graph does look somewhat symmetrical with a few outliers, which the data may be impacted by that. I do believe that this is an accurate representation, although we weren't really able to actually show how many students we surveyed that were part-time versus full-time. We can go through this and break down what part-time is. So maybe it's 3 classes or 4 classes, and full-time is 5 or more. So we can break down like that. But overall, the data was pretty evenly distributed. Now, when we go on to our commute time in 1 week, you can see that a lot of this was skewed to the right. Again, it was a moderate sample size with 54 people that we did survey. But there were multiple outliers that can affect the data, where our mean was 70, but if you look over here, it does look like most of our people that we did survey were within the 0 to 50-minute range. So now we go into the correlation coefficient. So you may be asking, what is that? The correlation coefficient is a number between -1 and 1 that tells you the strength and the direction of the relationship between variables. In other words, it reflects how similar the measurement of 2 or more variables are across the data set. So if we look over here, we see that 1 is a positive correlation. When one variable changes, the other variable changes in the same direction, which would be like this. Then we go on to 0, which this is no correlation, where there's no relationship between any of the variables, so one won't affect the other. And then we go on to our -1, which is a perfect negative. And this is when one variable changes the other variable, but in the opposite way. So this would change them. So now we did the correlation, or I did the correlation between classes enrolled and the commute time. So as you can see over here, the graph does suggest that there is a positive correlation between the number of classes enrolled and the time spent commuting. Since the correlation was 0.28, though it wasn't necessarily very significant due to the number that we had got in the correlation coefficient. This can be due to inaccurate data entries or more students taking online classes, therefore not having to commute. Although the actual correlation coefficient shows that it wasn't very significant, I do believe that there should be a positive correlation, just because the more classes that you are taking, if they are in person, the more you will be commuting from wherever you are to the school, which would cause it to increase. And now we go on to our hypothesis test and how we interpret it. So basically, a hypothesis test is the statistical method that's used to determine whether there's enough evidence to reject a specific hypothesis about the population parameter. The logic behind the hypothesis involves comparing the observed data to what we would expect if the null hypothesis was true. The null hypothesis basically states that there is no effect or difference in the population parameter being investigated. The null hypothesis is also a default assumption that there's no effect or difference in the population parameter being studied. It represents the status quo in ideas that any observed difference in the data are due to change alone. So in order to conduct a hypothesis test, a significance level is chosen to represent the probability of mistakenly rejecting the null hypothesis when it's actually true. Overall, the logic behind a hypothesis test is to involves making an educated guess about the population parameter, collecting data to either support or refuse its guess, and also using statistical methods to draw conclusions about the hypothesis. It's an essential tool that's used in statistics analysis for making informed decisions, which we also did, and that's where I came up with the positive correlation back on our other page. Thank you for listening. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I hope you guys learned a little bit more about statistics.